back to another edition of The Front Page. My name is Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Pleasure to have with me also my special guest today, Mr. Daniel French, who is the superintendent of the Bennington Rutland Supervisory Union. Dan, welcome to GNAT.
Thank you, Andrew.
Great to have you here. And the timing, of course, is perfect because in the next couple of weeks, folks out there watching the show will be, I'm sure, following the progress of school budgets as their various school districts move to finalize their school district budgets. And there'll be opportunities for folks to talk about those. And we want to talk a little bit about some of those budgetary issues as well, but also I wanted to take a little time before we got into that to talk a little bit about the educational side of that. I know we tend to focus a lot on the numbers and the financial side of all of that, but and sometimes I think we tend to forget about what's going on in the classroom, and
right.
That, of course, is really what it's all about.
Yeah.
So tell us, what trends do you see emerging in the classroom that strike you as really exciting or innovative or something that's just really different that you feel folks out there ought to know about?
Well, it's I agree. It's a great time to be talking about these topics because I think it is, certainly half of the budget conversation is about balancing our need to provide quality education to students and against our need to be fiscally responsible. So that's essentially the quandary that board members are in every year. And this year is especially difficult in that regard. But I like calling attention to the quality issue because I think there are, firstly, many things that we're proud of our schools. That our schools do quite well in the state and have been performing very well for a number of years. And that's our students represent a pretty diverse socioeconomic background. So that's, I think, commendable considering the diversity of our student body. At the same time, we're always looking for areas of improvement, and that's an ongoing approach. But I think, more recently in the last several years, we've been very interested in the implications of technology and how that not only might impact how we deliver instruction, but also essentially offer us the ability to extend learning opportunities for students, to expand curriculum opportunities, and basically change how we might deliver what we do. So. We've been working on that quite a bit, and it's pretty exciting work.
Now, does that involve like just having more computers in the school, or bringing more computers to a classroom on a desktop, or
right.
or what is exactly the new thing?
Well, that's certainly one aspect of it, and an important aspect. I think having worked with schools for a number of years, I think it's hard to move schools forward if students aren't being empowered as well, because I think the adults. Firstly, adults tend to be less tech savvy than this new generation of students, but
that's for sure.
Teachers always are inspired to do what's best for kids. So
right.
if kids are empowered with the technology through one-to-one or what have you, that they tend to move and to change their approaches. But it means a lot of different things. I think back to the curriculum idea that we can certainly what we call personalized instruction. We have new tools available to us that allow us to remediate for students and to provide extended learning opportunities for students. So we have more opportunity to expand our offerings in that regard. We have the ability to deliver curriculum 24/7, 365 days a year. So there's a lot of different aspects in terms of the curriculum. Certainly it points to changes in our infrastructure inside the building, how we're deploying wireless and so forth, and ultimately our need for more bandwidth, coming to the buildings.
Sure.
But all those things are in question, and I think there's aspects organizationally. That's the other big impact that we're, using technology more and more to improve our operational efficiency of our organization. And education, in many ways, was sort of left out of that revolution in the last 10 years. I've seen government studies that say in terms of technological intensivity, education was ranked the last next to coal mining, So
doesn't sound good.
And that's to be, I guess, acknowledged that we are a humanistic endeavor.
Right.
But there are many aspects from an operational standpoint that technology can help us become more efficient and more effective. So we're looking.
What about long distance learning? I mean, I remember
Right.
hearing about that going back 6-7 years. I guess the idea was that you'd have an instructor in front of a video camera in some classroom in some remote location, and that and students from 3 or 4 different schools would be able to kind of watch that presentation and interact, even ask questions. It'd be like
right.
a virtual classroom.
Right.
Is that? But I haven't heard much about that in recent years, and I just wonder, is that an idea that's kind of come and gone, or or what?
No, I think it's still very much a real part of the curriculum. I think probably now so much of that is done through the browser on the desktop as opposed to really needing some fancy
Okay,
networking
right.
equipment to do. But that's still very much part of how folks augment curriculum. And it's a great way in Vermont in particular with so many communities being in rural locations to bring our students those opportunities. For 15 years I lived in Canaan, Vermont, in the Northeast Kingdom, up on the Canadian border, and we did a lot of those things. So my favorite activity was live open heart surgery, and our students were able to
Wow.
watch that and
Yeah.
interact with the surgeons as they performed the procedure.
Holy
and
cow.
it was great.
I bet,
Kids
yeah.
really enjoyed it. Got to eat their lunch and watch that. It's a good time.
Oh, wow. Well, I know that technology certainly holds out a lot of promise in a lot of different fields,
Right.
and I'm sure that education, along with everyone else, is trying to keep up with what seems to be an amazing pace of change that accelerates year after year. As soon as you think you've, sort of cornered the beast, it's gone off and done something else. But anyway, let's turn into the whole financial budgetary side
Right.
of things. And as I said at the introduction, in a couple of weeks we'll have school districts finalizing their budgets, and they'll be presented to taxpayers at town meeting in a couple of months. Now, tell us a little bit about the BRSU schools, and I forgot to mention at the outset, though, that includes the towns of Manchester, Dorset, Paulet, Sunderland, Rupert, Danby, and Mount Tabor. Did I leave anybody out?
I think you got the towns. Yep.
All 7 towns?
Yep.
What is the outlook as you see it so far for the towns right here in our neighborhood?
Yeah, it's a diverse situation. I think there's 5. We operate 5 schools: the Meadowy Community School, the Courier Memorial School, Manchester Elementary Middle School, Sunderland Elementary School, and the Dorset School. Courier and Meadowy are union school districts and just operate K-6 districts, and the secondary costs related to those districts are in the town school districts of Paulet and Rupert, Mount Tabor, and Danby. So the union school districts in particular, it's always more challenging to develop their budgets because they don't have reserve funds. They have fewer things to monitor and to manipulate, if you will, to manage costs. So we're running some scenarios right now. The budget process is almost concluded at this point, and we're waiting. We have our first drafts on the table. Now we're waiting for sort of the tax implications of those numbers to come out, and that really isn't finalized until after the first of the year. And so that's the last time when we sort of make our last adjustments for the boards. But as an overall trend, I think the union school districts are always more difficult to produce responsive budgets because there's just fewer variables to control. The town school districts, on the other hand, they tend to have more options on the table. Particularly, Sunderland, Dorset, and Manchester have significant tuition costs embedded in their budget for secondary education, and those, as the overall demographic points to declining enrollment, that in some ways helps those districts because they have lowered tuition costs at the secondary level because there's
Right.
fewer students.
Right.
If the cost of tuition is about $14,000, one student is $14,000 savings. And if you look at the union school district, there's no such kind of variable for them to deal with. So the budgets are shaping up pretty well. We certainly, as a supervisory union, took the challenges for change very serious, and I believe we're going to be able to deliver, meet our target. And that's really it's a supervisory union-wide collaboration among our districts and the central office to lower costs and become more efficient. Operationally, things we've been working on for the last 3 years in terms of centralizing services, we're still following along those lines. So, business services are now completely centralized in the central office. That's paying off, pretty well for districts. And we're working on special education and transportation and a few other areas. So we've been working on those elements as a supervisory union, and I think, we're starting to see that pay off in the local budgets as well. And we'll keep, sizing our staff around declining enrollments or increasing enrollments. We have 2 schools that are increasing substantially. So Sunderland, the school went from 40 students last year to 63. So
That's quite a jump.
that in itself presents a significant challenge. So we'll be reviewing whether we had to add staff or not, in that case. So, it's sort of a mixed bag across the board, as it is every year. Districts are all in different situations, and at this point, we have sort of the first drafts finalized. Dorset still meets next week, and they'll look at their first draft. And then between now and the first of the year, administratively, we will review staffing patterns and make adjustments and recommendations to the board on areas of staffing, building needs, curriculum needs, and so forth. And then, iteratively go back and forth with the tax rate information as we get it from the state.
Now, let's back up a second and talk about the challenges for change. You mentioned that in the course of your answer there. That's a term that's been bandied about an awful lot in the last, almost 12 months now, I suppose.
Yeah.
I have a funny feeling a lot of people probably still don't really have a clear idea what it means. So I was wondering if you could maybe just give us a little explanation on what that involves, and particularly what it involves for education. And I guess the follow-up to that would be, as I understand it, the educational contribution towards the challenges of change is roughly $23 million in savings. And whether or not you feel that, how is that going? And I guess maybe on a statewide level, you mentioned that within the BRSU, the districts here look like they're on track to meet that target, which sounds more like the exception than the rule around the state from what I've been able to gather. And I guess thirdly, it's a voluntary kind of thing, and what happens if those targets aren't met?
That's a big question. Yeah, so, challenges for change, or what we call Act 146, was put in place to address, budgetary issues at the state level. And there is still a significant shortfall at the state level that will have to be addressed.
This is part of that $112 or so million deficit that the state is.
Yeah, I believe so. And as part of an initiative across all of state government to find reductions and also improve efficiencies and expand services at the same time. So each agency of the state was assigned a target and was given new requirements on how to work better and to improve service. Education is unique, however, in that it's not a state agency. It's really it's a cooperation between state and local government to deliver those services. So the legislature couldn't just go to the Agency of Education or the Department of Education and assess, here's your target, because it requires the cooperation of local school officials. So the compromise that was worked out was a voluntary approach, and I think it's a wise approach as opposed to the imposition approach, because that probably would have run afoul of some of the constitutional aspects of equity and what have you. But also I think the compromise of the voluntary approach was a good one, because I think last year the legislature was pleased that the local school officials were able to basically have a zero increase. And I think they fundamentally came to the conclusion that if they asked school officials to rise to the occasion again, that they would be able to do so.
Which would be about a 2% decrease.
It was about a $23 million target. It was voluntary, and then that target was apportioned out by a formula developed by the Department of Education this summer. And the target was assessed to each supervisory union. So the way the law reads, the target resides at the supervisory union level, but it requires a collaboration among the districts in the supervisory union and the supervisory union itself to meet the target or not. So that's how we've approached it. There are the individual districts sort of have sub-targets prepared by the Department of Education, but the target that's in the statute is the one that resides at the SU level. So when I talk about us meeting it or not, it's really that aggregate number that was assessed to us, and I believe we're going to meet it.
So what happens if that $23 million target isn't met?
Yeah.
It's a voluntary thing, but as I understand it, the state has already built those savings into the budget. So if they don't come up with that money...
Yeah, it's a big question, and I don't think one that's going to be answered immediately. I think, the way the law was constructed yesterday, December 15th, superintendents were required to report to the Department of Education as to whether or not the target was going to be met. What's happening today is they're compiling the results, and we'll find out to what extent the target was met or not statewide. And then under the law, the Commissioner of Education has until January 15th to report back to the legislature on how it went, and also his recommendations to fill in the gap. So we'll find out. There are several other mechanisms available to the legislature. Manipulating the base tax rate, lowering or freezing the base education payment, the dealing with some of the other reimbursement formulas that feed into our budget, such as transportation or special education. So there's other mechanisms available to them, and I would imagine it's going to be some combination of those that they'll use to fill the shortfall if there is one.
And where does this $19 million in federal money fit into that? I mean, my
Yeah.
understanding is that Governor-elect Shumlin wants to use that money,
Right.
if needed, towards this gap. It was money that outgoing Governor Douglas wanted to put towards the teacher pension fund or retirement fund.
So this is federal money that was sent to the states and was directed to go directly to school districts. So as much as there have been ideas about using it in some other way, it's pretty clear in the federal law that enabled the funds that it has to be, sent directly to districts. I think ultimately it probably will come out as part of the funding formula, so that, it could go a long way to reducing the $23.2 million target. But you're right, I think it does still leave us in the situation where we have to address a budget shortfall, and some other remedies are going to have to be addressed either structurally or immediately. So I think it does maybe take some pressure off for a couple months, but we'll be right back at it trying to resolve the fundamental, I think, structural inefficiencies of our system.
Yeah, because my understanding anyway, that's one-time money, and then
Right.
next year we're back kind of in the same place,
Right.
I guess.
Yeah.
Now, another thing that's been talked about a lot over the past year or so, actually probably for the past decade, maybe for longer than that, is this whole question of school consolidation.
Right. Have to go back 100 years.
100
I think,
years.
yeah.
I mean, we probably had
Yeah.
multiple consolidation waves sweep
Yeah.
through the Vermont education system since the 1770s or whatever. But I mean, it's been discussed by some, I guess, as some kind of not a silver bullet to solve all our problems, but at least one tool that could help reduce expenditures. Other people say, oh, wait a minute, how much are you really going to save?
Right.
Maybe $1 million here or $1 million there, which is a lot of money, of course, but, when you look at the grand scheme of things, that's really chump change.
Right.
Is it an avenue that needs to be explored, in your opinion, or?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. And I think like many leaders who work in the system right now, we're confident that there are greater efficiencies to be achieved, because it's not the public education system, in my view, isn't essentially a system. It's a sort of a collaborative effort, a federation, if you will, where local districts can choose or choose not to work together if they so fit, or see fit. So it's difficult to produce efficiencies in that kind of environment. And when you do produce them, they're usually temporary. And we can have turnover in board members and what have you, and then you're back to square one. So our supervisory union, for instance, right now, we're working very well together in terms of trying to maximize centralization where it's prudent, and maintaining local control of issues when they prefer. And that's working out well at the moment, but it's a fragile collaboration, and it's not one that is necessarily permanent or even lasting. So I think there are obvious inefficiencies in the system that need to be ironed out, and I'm not sure how we're going to get there voluntarily. I'm hopeful that we can get there that way, because I think that's probably the most intelligent way in terms of being most efficient and most responsive to community needs. But I'm not sure we'll get there soon enough to address the structural inefficiencies. And budget season's a time when this always comes up, because we end up in very difficult choices around cutting student programs, cutting services. And it's at that point, usually those dark moments, when board members are like, is there some other way,
Right.
We can do this? And
Right.
we get closer every year to, talking about potential consolidation. And then, we get through the budget season, and, off we go back to, things as usual.
Now, when we talk about consolidation, are we talking about consolidation of supervisory unions down from the 62 or 63 we have now down to a smaller number, or are we talking about consolidation of school districts? How is that supposed to work?
My view on the supervisory union issue is that unless we consolidate school districts, it doesn't make much sense to get rid of supervisory unions as they are. I mean, they exist largely to serve the districts that created them, even though the state board sort of controls the construction of the supervisory unions. We have so many school districts in Vermont. Until we make some move in that regard, I don't think it makes much sense. Our supervisory union right now has 9 school districts, and we're looking at possibly having other districts join our supervisory union, and it's hard for me to imagine how that's going to be managed unless we have some consolidation Or you're just going to have expanded central offices. We're going to be adding more assistant superintendents or what have you to serve the districts. So it's going to require, in my mind, a move to consolidating school districts, and then ultimately, I think looking at closing schools where that's prudent, and that's a hard one to do.
Well, I know, and a very unpopular one too, because I
Yeah.
don't think I can recall a single instance where any community or school district has sort of said, "Oh, well, yeah, we agree." I mean, I think the most recent instance was up in Sudbury. They had a vote on closing the
Right.
school there. 20 kids in the school,
Right.
and they all thought would rather pay higher taxes
Right.
than close the school.
Right.
So clearly, that's a huge
Yeah, it's
factor
it's
in
it's
people's
difficult,
minds.
and there are places where it just doesn't make sense, and there's places where it makes eminent sense.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, my approach would be to find the places where consolidation makes a lot of sense, where we could really maximize our savings, and to pursue those a little more aggressively than just sort of blanketly saying statewide, let's everyone talk about consolidation, because there's places where it makes a lot of sense. I closed the school when I was superintendent up north, and when I came here, people would ask me, well, what is that magic number when you close a school?
Mm-hmm.
And I disappoint them by telling when I closed the Norton Village School, it had 6 students. But you have to consider where Norton's located. Norton's a very isolated location relative to some of our communities, and those parents were faced with very difficult choices to put small children on a bus for a 30 to 40 minute ride down into Canaan on a good day. So that's a hard choice, and that's why they ended up keeping it open for so long. But when your schools are within 2 miles, 5 miles of other schools that are experiencing declining enrollment, I think we have to, we have to look at that a little more aggressively.
Yeah.
But I'm really believing that ultimately we'll hopefully be able to keep small schools alive, at least K6 or K4 schools. The smaller children, I think we should maintain schools near them, near the families. And I think ultimately as we get to the upper grades, that's when we have the opportunity to do more consolidation. And that's, I think, educational. If we don't, we do the students a real disservice. I think particularly at the middle level, we should be looking to create a central program for our students so we can offer a wider range of course offerings for those students.
What's going on with pre-K education? There was some discussion about that during the gubernatorial campaign that recently passed. Are we going to be seeing a more expanded range of pre-K educational opportunities in some schools, or is it going to be mandatory, or what's going to be happening?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think educationally, I haven't found an educator who disputes the fact that it's a wise investment. Early education is certainly probably our best investment in terms of the overall system. I think the problem is right now we haven't found a way to fund it, and
because I would have thought that means more money.
yeah,
right?
and I think if the question is how can we already slice up the small pie and redistribute the resources,
that's more.
Yeah, and that's what we've experienced, I think, with Act 62, which was the latest early ed law. It certainly encouraged, to a certain extent, expansion, but our districts are really grappling with the costs related to that. And I think, if you look at our funding streams for early education, they certainly haven't kept pace with our costs. And we've taken on a lot, I think, in the public education system, and maybe appropriately, but we certainly haven't been provided the funding stream support for what we've taken on in terms of cost.
Right. As we're getting near the end of our time here, I did want to ask you one question about sort of on a more global framework here, about how students in the United States and Vermont are doing. Occasionally I read these test scores from that students from all over the world are being tested in one thing or another, and it seems like the U.S. always winds up being like somewhere in 20th or 30th place or something way down the list, and you go, oh my God, what's going on here? How are we going to compete with these other nations like South Korea and Singapore? Finland always seem to be at the top. If their students are going to be so much, smarter than ours, and particularly in the global economy that seems to be clearly emerging, and rewarding educated societies more and more.
Absolutely.
What are we supposed to make of that? Is that are those fair tests, or are they apples to oranges comparisons, or what's going on with those numbers?
No, I think we should be looking at any assessment like that as an opportunity to learn, from what we're doing and to craft policy accordingly. And if I was the U.S. Commissioner of Education, I'd be unpacking those results and trying to figure out why is the U.S. scoring the way it is. And the PISA results that just came out show the U.S. scoring in the middle. And I know, in the United States we have some of the best schools in the world, and we have some of the worst schools in the world. And it's not surprising to me that we're scoring in the middle, and it's not surprising to me that our poor students are substantially behind poor students in other countries. I think we should look at South Korea and Finland and Singapore and not necessarily emulate, but at least try to find out what they're doing. I've done sort of a cursory review of those results, and there are some commonalities that are, pretty basic. One is universal pre-K. You have to take care of that. Another is the idea that you find out where your worst performing schools are, and you bring them up to speed. And the other thing I think that's common in all those countries that I mentioned was that there's a national priority of education. That education is essential to their economic and national survival. I don't necessarily think we have that sense of urgency in the United States. And I think more to the point, some of our federal policies, especially the ones we're about to embark upon, the Common Core and what's a second version of the No Child Left Behind Act, are actually going to lead us further astray and probably create a lot of more bureaucratic stuff for us to do. We've had to increase staff for just the sake of maintaining our bureaucracy more than anything else. So I think at some point as a country we need to figure out how to get people to perform in places where they're really not performing. I don't think Vermont is one of those places. Vermont, I think, stands up pretty well to any state in the country. But I think until we make it a national priority, that we're gonna continue to lag. And
that's amazing, considering the amount of money that gets spent on education in this country.
Right,
you would think that we'd be getting better results than that.
I think it's a lot of it gets siphoned into bureaucratic systems. The Common Core, as admirable a solution as it is, I think is going to be a boon to test makers and put us through a whole new generation of test taking and the whole 9 yards. So. We need to stop doing a lot less of that and focus a little more on the basics, which, taking care of kids and making sure they're ready to learn when they get to school. Our safety net in the country is shot, and, the schools have been picking up a lot of the slack for that, particularly in Vermont. So, we do dental care to mental health to everything else. And, if kids don't come to school ready to learn, that's a national crisis.
Well, Dan, I think we could probably talk about that for a lot longer.
Yeah, okay.
I find this very fascinating.
Yeah.
What we're trying to do here, it's certainly extremely important stuff. And,
it is.
Hopefully, the trend lines will start moving in the right direction. But anyway, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and thank all of you for watching. This has been the Front Page on GNAT. My name is Andrew McKeever. I hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you again the next time.